So thank you to Revity for inviting me here to speak at the conference. Happy to be here. Imagine you're a patient. You've been diagnosed with an uncommon and difficult to treat form of cancer. Your oncologist has identified an industry-sponsored clinical trial which has shown promising results in an early phase. You're one of 60 people who will potentially be able to enter this study. Luckily, you meet all the criteria to enroll. Your friends and family will bring you to the study site to get you the treatments and the scans in the weeks and months ahead. The site's 40 miles away, but the drive is worth it if the drug works and rids you of the cancer. Your initial CT scan showed two tumors, one the size of a grape and the other the size of a pea. You feel anxious, thinking the tumors have certainly grown in the last week. You just hope it doesn't spread. And then you start. And the first cycle of treatment in the clinic went okay. The side effects were expected and unpleasant. There was nausea, throwing up, swelling up, dizziness. You trust you took all the doses last weekend, but can't remember for sure. All your medical papers and diaries were at home while you enjoyed a weekend away from it all at your friend's house. In 2 weeks, you'll go in for another doctor visit, another scan, and to get more pills. And they'll sort it out. 4 weeks later, being claustrophobic, and in that tube, it amplifies the bad thoughts. You just close your eyes and stay still. Why me? Why right now? Did my tumors get smaller? Did they grow? Are they gone? Is this drug that's making me throw up doing anything for the cancer? You'll wait another 2 weeks to find out if the drug is working and if you'll be allowed to stay on the study. So that story highlights a patient perspective, and it highlights that the perspective of medicine and disease is different from that of the clinical trial sponsor or CRO, where most of us work. It's one person, one drug, and a lot of hope. And the farthest thing from a patient's mind when getting treatments for cancer, for example, are the complexities that we face on a daily basis as an industry, or when starting up a trial or sponsoring one or conducting a clinical trial. And this schematic is one perspective, a biopharma research perspective, a place where I've worked for a long time, but it highlights the intertwining connections and the interfaces we all have with each other and with other organizations, and some more than others. It's a complex network of regulations, organizations, people, and processes in the US. And not to mention the complexities of going global. So navigating international regulatory agencies and rules makes global trials even more complex. Oh, and let's not forget how difficult just getting that drug into the clinic actually is. So R&D is complex in its own right, and translational and preclinical data as it approaches the clinic, it's not big data, but it can be complicated. And getting the candidate out of research and into the clinic is not trivial. So there's good news that there are more trials starting, and the acceleration of new studies shows no sign of slowing down. And this data cut from clinicaltrials.gov shows the trend in registration of early phase oncology studies by registration year over year over the last 10 years is growing. It's not slowing down. And all of the phases have their own challenges. Phase 3 studies have the characteristics of larger numbers of patients, sometimes more sites, blinds that create data management challenges. The early phase recruitment in oncology trials can be challenging due to an increase in demand and rivalry for the same patient group amongst studies for the same indication, study design difficulties that can turn into amendment management challenges. Early phase studies may have tight eligibility requirements that make it even more difficult to enroll. And while precision oncology is very real, there's limited proven sometimes direct therapeutic benefit alongside safety concerns that place risk on patients. And there's other challenges at the sites. So the number of studies, active studies in early phase oncology, for example, is high at a small number of sites. And you can see the top 5 here in the US. 4 out of 5 are in the US and 1 is in Korea. They range from carrying 100 to close to 250 active early phase oncology studies all at the same time. So the site burden can translate to burden on patients, staff turnover, burnout. It's a very real thing, and it can impact study conduct and the quality of a study negatively. And fast global growth in clinical trials, while it's good for patients on one hand, it can lead to data complexity in the form of disjointed data systems, and that's what we see a lot of. So this creates a challenge for data management as well as medical monitoring and operational teams when they need to make decisions related to their studies. The questions always arise. Do we have all the PK results transferred and reconciled? Do we have all the central read scans in the system that are needed? Are the dosing logs correct, complete? Does this patient have prior therapy, etc., etc.? The questions are always there. It leads to slow and suboptimal decision-making across the study teams. So what are effective approaches to help reduce data complexity and increase the quality of data for decision-making? So there's many, but there's one simple approach, and there's no silver bullet, but an approach I like is to work backwards or start at the end. So in the clinical world, it's about study outcomes. What's the end point of the study? So starting at the end works well when thinking about how to reduce complexity because it creates a focus for data management teams, business analysts, and programmer work on the core data sets with a priority. So starting at the end, it enables teams and sponsors and sites to collect and enter and clean and validate the vendor and EDC systems and data with explicit prioritization. It helps focus. And it works just as well for small studies as it does for large ones. So here we take a quick look at what starting at the end means in the context of one example. So this is an ovarian cancer study with 300 plus patients. We can use an assessment of the published public study outcomes to show how to drive data management priorities and other downstream processes and analyses. And they're built around this concept of using analytics and visualizations to help with prioritization of data management and other activities. So for this study, if we look kind of left to right, you have the title, and then you see the various bins, call them, of the outcomes. So the larger bins are things like PK, pharmacokinetics, efficacy, patient-reported outcomes. As we move to the right, you see the specificity here of whether it's a primary or secondary outcome. So just taking a look at the top row there, we have the first secondary outcome, which is PK. So PK, for example, requires active management of the EDC visit, was it done or not done, the pharmacokinetic data, and the external lab data is highlighted in red. And the merger of that data, it's a relatively simple merge based on sample ID and the results for that visit or the visits. That creates a focal data point for that secondary PK outcome. Moving down a row, you see the first primary outcome for the study is progression-free survival, so PFS of investigator-assessed RECIST. So for that, we need the tumor assessments and the overall response data. Simple, but it's important to continue to collect, monitor, clean, make sure that the data is complete. And then as we move down, there's other secondary efficacy assessments. So one is a progression analysis, which integrates the cancer antigen CA125 and the death data. There's another PFS analysis, which requires integration of sequence variants for BRCA genes, and other secondary outcomes which require a mix of end-of-study, follow-up, and death data. And then finally, there's a patient-reported outcome, which is a standard quality of life questionnaire, and that can sometimes be managed in the EDC, but more often as an external auxiliary data set. And then, of course, there's a fundamental set of data that includes safety for monitoring, AEs, exposure, and dosing, which supplement or provide sort of the basis of integration. But overall, if we take the outcome, work backwards approach, we can prioritize the data entry and cleaning for a total of 11 data sets, 4 external and 7 EDC data sets. So the key is what we do with those data sets and the prioritization. So one thing we can do is we can use these smaller prioritized sets of data related to study outcomes to help focus our clean patient tracking activities across the study. So these smaller prioritized data sets related to the outcomes, not only for data management, but also enable the generation of KPI metrics and alerts for monitoring based around the various outcomes. And additionally, we can use these smaller scope and sets of prioritized data around outcomes in other contexts, like aligning with biostatistics teams and the activities which support the interim data cut analyses, downstream medical writing teams, and regulatory feedback and document submission requirements. And finally, outcomes in this way help focus what to automate. So in our study example we showed here, we would automate the investigator scan, entry, and analysis to support primary PFS RECIST outcome that quite literally drives the entire study. And we would also agree on how to integrate the auxiliary biomarker and sequence variant data sets to automate the few secondary outcome analyses. In other studies, we would automate the integration of analysis of central read and investigator read scans so that we can do best overall response concordance in cases where blinded independent central reads are primary or secondary outcome. So I'll close by saying, as an industry, we can acknowledge the complexity of what we do day to day without accepting it. It doesn't benefit the patients, that complexity. But we can also strive to reduce the complexity across our organizations and processes, and especially in our data, because we owe it to the patients. Thank you.